Good and evil are well-known concepts. Such associations as light and darkness, angels and demons, yin and yang arise with them. But what do these concepts mean? Both of these concepts are categories of morality, but we cannot give them a clear definition because it does not exist. Goodness is presented in our consciousness as something good, corresponding to morality. Evil, on the contrary, is something contrary to morality. Many people relate good and evil as something done according to the rules and something contrary to them, but this is not always the case. A lot has been written about the nature of good and evil, and even more has been said. Let's not repeat ourselves. Anyone can easily find many definitions from any point of view, social, religious, and the like. We'll talk about something else. What is meant by evil in the everyday approximation? Evil is what prevents us from satisfying our desires and needs. Well, the good thing, on the contrary, is that it helps. I gave a beggar 100 rubles. I did good. If you took a candy from a child, you committed evil. But what about slightly more complicated cases? For example, a bloody maniac, after a series of crimes, is finally caught, convicted, and put on the electric chair. Does he want to sit on a chair and then die? Of course not. The outrage that is being done to him, from our point of view, is evil. He only gets what he deserves. What he really deserved, because if he wasn't a maniac, he would have lived like a man without such a finale. Of course, here the assessment should be much more differentiated. From the simplest dichotomy, it is necessary to move on to a slightly more complex assessment scale. Good and evil are known to be defined through each other, but in general these are rather vague philosophical and moral categories, which are extremely difficult to define. However, they are fundamental both for social existence and for being in general. The struggle between good and evil is widely represented in the religious tradition, for example, in the form of confrontation between God and Satan. In other cultures, these divine entities are called differently, but they all lead an eternal, irreconcilable struggle for the dominance of their ideas and for the human soul. The same struggle is represented in philosophical concepts, as well as in social and exact sciences and everyday practice. It is the struggle for good against evil that motivates most of the most significant social actions, events, and processes. None of them is complete without an appeal to the good and the just cause, which opposes evil, no matter what personalized forms it takes: people, ideas, viruses, diseases, cities, and countries. Even the battery has plus and minus poles. In the conventional sense, good is associated with a plus, evil with a minus. Everyone strives to be kind. After all, if a person is considered kind, it gives him a number of social preferences, facilitates relationships with other people, while evil is scourged and eradicated in every possible way. Thus, we see that the concepts of good and evil permeate all human life, and at the same time, available sources in the form of philosophical dictionaries and arguments of moral tuning forks of various purity of sound cannot clearly explain what it is. Our everyday experience is also quite powerless in this. Any definition of goodness or a specific example of it stands on shaky grounds and immediately turns into its opposite. If lying is evil, and then what is a lie for salvation? Taking a life is evil, but what if you kill the enemy? The basis of a person's everyday and scientific knowledge about the world and about himself is the reflection in consciousness and word of surrounding phenomena, objects, their properties and interrelationships. The concepts of good and evil also arose in the process of cognition of the world. With high probability, it can be argued that they are not some kind of scholasticism, some kind of exclusively artificial speculative categories. These concepts are indeed fundamental qualities of the infinitely diverse surrounding reality. Since these concepts are fundamental, the answer to the question of defining what is good and evil can be found in the logic of the development of the universe and its reflection of human life. This logic of development from simple to complex is true both for the cosmos and for the evolution of life. This pattern manifests itself most prominently in the logic of human development, whose life is gradually becoming more complicated both individually and socially. At the same time, it should be noted that social development in a sense duplicates the physical development of the body. These analogies confirm that the laws of biological evolution and the development of society are determined by similar trends in the complexity of elements and the creation of productive relationships. These universal processes of movement from simple to complex, which are accompanied by the creation of increasingly complex systems, within and between which effective relationships are formed, leading to further complication of systems and the formation of new relationships, are described by the concepts of good and evil. Goodness is something that is beneficial, desirable, useful for a person or for any system. In this regard, the process of moving from simple to complex, the process of including new elements in the system and establishing useful effective relationships between them most fully reflects the concept of goodness. Even at the household level, a kind person is one who selflessly helps another, who is generous and responsive. That is, good people create new useful relationships and contribute to the complexity of the system and its development. The concepts of love and friendship, interconnected with goodness, are a cementing factor either between two or between many people. All this contributes to the transformation of individualized homogeneous elements into a kind of superunity, united by common desires, emotions, creating new useful relationships. There are many examples that confirm that in any situation where a good or a good deed appears, we are talking about complicating the system, establishing new effective relationships both between the elements of the system and between the system and the surrounding world, making it more flexible, adapted to current conditions, creating a kind of whole that becomes more of a component of its totality elements. Meanwhile, the concepts of good and evil are mutually defined, so evil is everything that leads to disintegration, to the rupture of useful connections and to the return of the system to a previous, more primitive level. In this logic, death is the absolute evil. After all, as a result of death, the body disintegrates, all useful connections are broken both between the elements of the body and with the surrounding world. This concept of evil is vividly reflected in the Old Testament commandments, "Thou shalt not kill," "Thou shalt not steal," and so on. And all these concepts, describing evil in various forms, mean destruction of useful connections and damage to the system. In other words, goodness describes the basic property of the development of the universe, life and human society. And evil is everything that leads to the destruction of the system, to damage it and to the destruction of useful connections. Synonyms of good and evil can be considered synergy, that is, the improvement of the system and its assembly at a higher quality level, and, accordingly, entropy as degradation and the increase of chaos. In this context, the phenomenon of the struggle between good and evil becomes clear as a confrontation between progress, creation and improvement on the one hand and destruction, simplification, ignorance on the other. It is important to remember that good and evil, being the positive and negative poles of physical and social processes, create prerequisites for purposeful movement and development, because the hypothetical final eradication of one of them will inevitably destroy the second member of the pair. Therefore, being driven by even the most noble and kind motives, the main thing is not to cross the line where all these motives and impulses will turn into their opposite. To summarize, we can say that we cannot define such relative concepts as good and evil, because there can be many interpretations. Also, we cannot say what is the criterion for determining good and bad deeds. After all, everyone can have their own criteria, and these concepts are inextricably linked to each other, since no one can be constantly good or bad. And this is really only possible in theory, because each of us cares about ourselves and our loved ones more than about strangers. But is this selfishness? After all, it is quite natural to treat people differently, and after all, we do not commit any evil, paying more attention to our relatives and friends. Therefore, such a degree of impartiality should not be required of people. In addition, good and evil cannot be absolute concepts because they differ from each nation, from each epoch. What is now considered unacceptable was previously considered quite natural. Slavery, serfdom, human sacrifice, racial segregation, infringement of religious and political freedoms, hereditary caste systems, and the like. And it is very likely that the society of the future will consider evil what you now recognize as good. That is why we can talk about the relative criteria of good and evil, because we cannot say that moral requirements are universal.